Hi everyone. I had planned to cover the progress Māori made during the years immediately following signing to Tiriti, but after reading through your comments on my podcast on Māori ceding sovereignty, I thought it would be helpful to clarify just how I have approached learning about our history. All of us grow up absorbing opinions from family and friends, or from the news media or other influences like social media. And these opinions can become entrenched as we get older, but they may not be correct. And this was evident in many of the comments that were submitted. A classic example for me was my own ideas about Māori life at the time leading up to the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. So when I read Trevor Bentley's book, Pākehā Slaves, Māori Masters, my immediate reaction was that he was biased against Māori, as he had described Māori making shipwrecked Europeans their slaves and even killing and eating them. I did know a little about the musket wars, but this was too challenging to get my head around. I had just read Vincent O'Malley's book on the treaty and the land wars that followed, and he described nothing like that. I next read Ron Crosby's book on the musket wars, which I also found hard to accept, even though it seemed to have been well researched. A Pākehā man writing about Māori life, probably with some bias. Finally, I stumbled across Te Raparaha Anui, written by Te Raparaha's son and translated into English by Ross Kalman, who is one of his descendants. Te Raparaha was a famous Māori leader who has been described as the Napoleon of the South for his conquests of the Lower North Island and the South Island. So at last I had an authentic Māori perspective. Tamihana Te Raparaha had travelled on his father's expeditions while still a young boy. He was proud of what his father had achieved, and he wanted to preserve his memory. And yet, what he described was horrific. Intertribal fighting, genocide, and slavery were all through the book. I finally realised that I needed to step back from everything that I had thought I had understood. I began searching out as many first-hand accounts of this time in New Zealand as I could find. Fortunately, many of these earlier accounts are available in books or online in government and university archives. They include missionary diaries and letters, accounts by ship's captains and traders, as well as Pākehā men who lived as Pākehā Māori, marrying Māori women and living as Māori. I've listed many of these on my website, where you can download their PDFs to read for free. What they all describe is a life so different from what we know today as to be unrecognisable. Life was hard. Intertribal fighting was endemic and was made much worse when Europeans arrived and began trading in muskets. Each tribe's security depended on their ability to fight, as well as the capability of their leaders. Cruelty, mass slaughter, slavery, and even cannibalism were the norm. Slaves were taken like cattle on war expeditions and were killed and eaten along the way. Men, women, and children in villages were killed and eaten. If a chief was killed or died, some of his slaves would be killed and eaten to balance the loss. So, where did this information come from? Here are a few of my sources. In February 1820, Richard Cruise arrived in the Bay of Islands, where he spent the next 10 months observing and interacting with local Māori. He recorded this in his journal, which was published in 1824. Though well aware of our abhorrence of cannibalism, they never denied it to be one of their customs. On the contrary, they too often expressed their predilection for human flesh. The limbs only of a man are eatable, while, with the exception of the head, the whole body of a female or a child is considered delicious. Besides the crew of the Boyd, other Europeans have, from time to time, fallen victim to their ferocity. But they described the flesh of a white man as tough and unpalatable when compared with that of their own countrymen. And they attribute its inferiority to our universal practice of using salt with our food. Instances occurred during our residence among them, and under the eyes of Europeans, of female slaves having been murdered for crimes too trifling to justify such severity. And as their bodies were immediately cut up, washed and removed to a place where they could be eaten without interruption. 11 years later, in December of 1831, a war party of around 4,000 Waikatos attacked Ngāti Awa in Taranaki. Ngāti Awa panicked and rushed to their strong pa at Pukerangiora without time to take sufficient provisions. Benjamin Wells described what followed in his book, The History of Taranaki. For 12 successive days, the enemies made repeated assaults, but were constantly repulsed and lost in these attacks 36 men. Famine and watchfulness now reduced the garrison to a state of despondency. Instead of stealing away under the cover at night, they made the mistake of attempting an evacuation in the daytime. The enemy perceived this, pursued and captured numbers of the half-famished wretches. Then mothers threw their children over the precipice and leaped themselves into the river below to avoid a more dreadful fate at the hands of their sanguinary foes. The captives were driven into forays and guarded by sentinels armed with sharp tomahawks. On that day, the Waikatos glutted themselves with the flesh of the slain. On the morrow morning, nearly 200 prisoners were brought out. Those who were well tattooed were beheaded on a block for the sake of their heads. Some of the remainder were slain by a blow or a cut on the skull. On others, every refinement of cruelty was practiced, particularly the thrusting of a red-hot ramrod up the bowels. Children and youths were cut open, eviscerated, spitted and roasted over fires made from the defences of the dismantled pa. In his book, King Patata'o, the Ngāti Maniapoto leader Peiti Hiranui provides a more sanitised account of the siege from Waikato's perspective. However, he still described scenes of violence as some Waikato and Maniapoto relatives of the dead chiefs exacted revenge by killing the remaining prisoners and consigning them to the steaming earth ovens. Then, in January 1841, soon after the treaty had been signed, the Reverend John Morgan and his wife moved to Otafo, now Te Awamutu. As recorded by Baron Gascoigne in their book, The Plough of the Pākehā, shortly after their arrival at Otafo, Mrs. Morgan was deeply shocked by the sight from her kitchen window of 11 slaves being murdered in preparation for a cannibal feast taking place. Earlier, the Reverend Brown had expressed his deep concern that cannibalism was still rife in many parts of the country, while Tamihana Tūraparaha didn't describe cannibalism in his book, preferring not to record all of what he saw. Ross Kalman's statement in the introduction is important. It is not without some trepidation that I published Tamihana's narrative. Some of this history makes for uncomfortable reading. it was a completely different world back then, with its own codes of behaviour. I think Uncle Iwi Nicholson put this best while presenting evidence to the Waitangi tribunal. He said, "Well, that's the traditional Māori world. What they did was to kill people, eat people, forcibly take possessions and land, undertake conquests. Even though it's unpleasant, that's the traditional Māori world and its customs." Ross Kalman then concludes, "I believe that it does no good to hide this history away and pretend it didn't happen. It is part of who we were and are still. I believe a greater understanding of our history, including the difficult, uncomfortable episodes, is necessary for acknowledging that these painful things happened. By being open about the past, we can all heal and move on from these events." When Tamihana Te Rauparaha ignored his father's command and spent a year with Ngāi Tahu to seek reconciliation following his father's South Island invasions, he set an example for us all. Ngāi Tahu and Ngāti Toa found a peaceful way to move forward. We need a firm foundation to build on if we are to be successful in moving forward to build a better future. This is not about apportioning blame. It is not about race. It is about finding the best path forward. These statements are not uninformed personal opinions. They are records of what was observed at the time by men and women from very different backgrounds. While one or two might have had some bias, when they all agree, these observations have to be accepted as being factual. And there are many more such examples, like the accounts of the Boyd massacre in 1809, Edward Manning's description of the Māori chief that owned him, and Percy Smith's description of Hongi's campaign through the Waitemata. This was a violent time that only slowly came to an end after the treaty was signed at Waitangi. I've described this time to explain how I have approached researching our early history. For the record, I am not a white supremacist, as some have claimed in their comments. I have a great admiration for what many Māori have achieved. Māori language is important and should be encouraged. Māori culture has evolved over time and is an integral part of our shared New Zealand culture. We should celebrate that. The Māori economy is growing. Māori artists and sports people are doing amazing things. We have Māori leaders in both our national and local governments. But there are still problems, both from our past and that also exist today. I've begun this study of our history to help me understand what should be done and to share it with others. I've separated my book, Moving Forward from Our Past, into two sections. The first being to simply present factual information as recorded at the time, while in the second section I have attempted to draw my own conclusions in order to understand how we should move forward. So, my challenge to you all is to do the same. Expressing opinions without evidence to support them carries no weight. When everyone is promoting uninformed opinions, the result can only be polarization and division. Nobody wins. Is it not better to establish what really happened, both good and bad, on both sides, so that we can see the real problems and work together to resolve them and build a better future? I also ask you to listen to my first podcast on the background to the treaty at Waitangi. That will help you understand why the Māori chiefs were willing to sign to Te Reti. You can read it in much more detail for yourselves in my book on moving forward from our past. It provides all the detailed references. And this is not the whole story. The time following the treaty introduced a whole new chapter in Māori history, as New Zealand was colonised by the British. There was also disappointment and loss of trust when the settler government failed to fulfil their promises. There was both good and injustice during that time. I will cover this in future podcasts.